Welcome to Pacer TV. My name is David Lapp from Research for Action, and today we're going to talk about special education funding in charter schools in Pennsylvania. I know it doesn't get a lot more specific than that, but this is actually a pretty fascinating topic, and it's getting a lot of attention from policymakers in Pennsylvania. Recently, Governor Tom Wolf released a bipartisan plan, and it's accompanied by legislation from the General Assembly to totally change the way we fund special education in charter schools. And 80% of school boards across Pennsylvania have passed resolutions calling on the General Assembly to pass that legislation. So why all this attention to this very specific topic? Well, it's because the current system is heavily skewed by three problems. Let's call it the Commonwealth triple whammy, with appreciation to Professor Bruce Baker, who coined a similar term. But today we want to demonstrate how these whammies are impacting the system. So I'll describe them quickly and then we'll dig in. The first whammy is an assumption that's built into the law that miscounts the number of students receiving special education, and that means charter schools often receive more funding than they actually spend on special education. The second whammy is that because students with high-cost special education needs are often under-enrolled in charter schools, it drives up per-pupil spending in school districts which serve those students in greater numbers. And the third whammy, and this is the one that very few people understand, is that the overpayments from whammy number 1 and whammy number 2 are baked into the system. And that means they compound into future years and artificially drive the charter tuition rate higher and higher over time. Lots of people have written about this, and there's resources below where you can learn more. But there's still a lot of confusion as to how and why this is all happening. So let's try to clear that up today.
But first, let's back up a second and remember that school districts receive funding from a combination of local, state, and federal resources. And of course, districts must use that funding to provide special education services that students are entitled to under the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Back in 2014, the state of Pennsylvania adopted a new funding formula that identified 3 tiers or cost categories with multipliers that were designed to drive more state funding for special education to districts that were serving students with the highest cost needs. Charter schools also need to comply with the IDEA, and the commission that created the formula recommended that it also apply to charter schools. But many charter advocates noted that the new system would provide fewer resources to charter schools than the current system, and argued that the state shouldn't change special education funding without changing non-special education funding, and ultimately succeeded in preventing the funding formula from being applied to charter schools. Charter schools are funded differently than school districts. Charter schools, of course, are free for students to attend, but they don't come free to the system as a whole. The vast majority of funding for charter schools comes directly from school districts from which the attending student resides. That per pupil rate is often called tuition. Current law provides one method of calculating tuition for non-special education students and a second rate for students who do receive special education. And because services are more expensive for students receiving special education, that tuition rate is often as much as 2 or even 3 times as much as the rate for non-special education. But some quirks in the law have caused that tuition rate to inflate over time. Let's get into the current calculation. Even though the whammies prevent it from working properly, it's actually very simple. Each district calculates its own rate. The way it works is that after school districts deduct federal funding, which charter schools receive separately, school districts total the amount that they spend on their own students in year 1. Then they add that to the amount that they spend on charter school tuition in the same year. Then, to get a per pupil tuition rate, they divide that not by the actual number of students receiving special education, but by 16% of the total student enrollment, both students receiving special education and non-special education students. The law then requires school districts to use that quotient as the per pupil charter school special education tuition rate in year 2. So districts use expenditures and enrollment from one year to calculate tuition for the following year. To get the final rate, districts also add tuition for regular education, but today we're focused specifically on the special education portion of that calculation.
Some of you are probably already wondering, why 16%? It used to be that on average, school districts had around 16% of their students receiving special education. But in recent years, that rate has been climbing significantly over 16%. And more importantly, in school districts with high charter enrollment, the special education rate is as much as 20 or even 30% of their total student body. And as we'll see, that's having a significant impact on the charter tuition calculation. Let's demonstrate with a hypothetical school district. We'll call it Sylvania School District.
So here we have 100, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1,000 total students in Sylvania School District, and 200 of those students are receiving special education. Now, you math whizzes out there have already figured out that 200 of 1,000 is 20%. That's different than 16%, and we'll see how that matters. But let's focus in on those 200 students, and let's call this year 0, because this year there are no charter schools in Sylvania School District. But remember, we use 1 year to calculate the tuition for the following year, when we will add a charter school. As we discussed, the special education funding formula categorizes students in 3 cost categories. So let's recategorize our students here in Sylvania. Tier 1 students in Sylvania are costing on average about $10,000 per student. Tier 2 students are costing $30,000, and Tier 3 students are costing $60,000 per student per year. Remember, this is on top of regular education tuition, so the actual amount is even higher, but we just want to focus on the special education portion today. As in every school district, the majority of students in Sylvania School District fall under Tier 1 cost category. Here we have 160 students in Tier 1, 30 students in Tier 2, and 10 students in Tier 3, and that breaks down into 80%, 15%, and 5% respectively. These Sylvania rates across the tiers are not just made-up numbers, they are roughly the average distribution of Pennsylvania districts that have high charter school enrollment. Now, to figure out what the district is actually spending per pupil, we'd simply multiply the number of students in Tier 1 by their average cost, and do the same in Tier 2 and Tier 3. When we put it all together here, we see that in total, Sylvania School District is spending $3.1 million on special education services. And if you do the math on what that looks like at a per pupil rate, of course, you divide the total number by the total number of students, which is 200 students, and that gives you $15,500 per student. That's the actual cost of what Sylvania School District is spending on special education. And as we do this hypothetical, that's not going to change as a system-wide actual cost. However, that is not how we calculate charter school special education tuition. To do that, the law requires that the district combine the total number of its own expenditures on its own students, plus the expenditures it makes in the form of charter school tuition. Well, here in year 0, we have no charter schools, so that's 0. Then the district takes that total and divides it, not by the actual number of students receiving special education, but by 16% of the total number of students. So since Sylvania has 1,000 students in this situation, they divide that spending by 160 students, and that gives us $19,375 per student. That's the special education tuition rate for charter schools in year 1.
And this is the first whammy in the Commonwealth triple whammy for charter school special education funding. Because the law miscounts students, the district is sending the charter school tuition that's nearly $4,000 more per pupil than it's spending on its own students. Let's bring in a charter school and see how that impacts the whole calculation.
Here we are now, it's year 1, and Choice Charter School enters into the system. This first year, 18 Tier 1 students receiving special education from Sylvania School District leave and attend Choice Charter. 1.6 students leave from Tier 2, and 0.4 students leave from Tier 3. Of course, we wouldn't have fractions of students in real life, and typically in a school system there would be much larger numbers. But this is a hypothetical situation, and we're using small numbers to demonstrate the larger point, and we'll see how this works out to whole numbers by the end. So you may have already noticed that the students entering Choice Charter are not evenly distributed across the 3 tiers, as in the district. 90% of the students in Choice Charter are in Tier 1, 8% in Tier 2, and 2% in Tier 3. That's very different than in Sylvania School District before Choice Charter, which had 80% in Tier 1, 15% in Tier 2, and 5% in Tier 3. So to calculate what the charter school is actually spending, we do the same math. We take the total number in Tier 1, 2, and 3 and multiply each by their average cost. This comes out to a total cost of $252,000. To find the per pupil cost, you divide by 20 students, and that gives a per pupil cost of $12,600. So there's an even bigger gap between the tuition rate charter schools receive and the amount that the Choice Charter is actually spending on special education. Charter schools in Pennsylvania are free to use those extra dollars in any way they wish. Now finally, to calculate the total amount that the district spent on tuition in year 1, you'd multiply that tuition rate times 20 students, which gives us $387,500, which we'll need for next year's tuition calculation. Now, when a charter school enrolls students from a school district, that impacts spending at the district as well. So let's look back at Sylvania in year 1. Year 1, we see Sylvania is down to 142 students in Tier 1, 28.4 students in Tier 2, and 9.6 students in Tier 3. That brings our total spending to $2,848,000. Now, because there's fewer students, the total spending on district students has gone down, but the per pupil amount has actually gone up. To get our actual per pupil cost, we divide not by 200 students because they've lost 20 students, but by 180 students, and that gives us $15,822 per pupil of actual cost. Notice that that's $322 more than the district was spending in year 0.
And that is the second whammy. Because the charter school has taken many of the low-cost students, it's meant that the per pupil cost in the school district has gone up. Now, it's not a lot this first year, but keep watching and we'll see how it impacts in future years.
And remember, this actual per pupil cost is not the way we calculate charter tuition in the next year. To do that, the law requires we take the amount of spending the district spent on its own students in year 1 and add the amount it spent on charter tuition in year 1, which was $387,500. We divide that sum, again, by 160 students, 16% of the total student body.
So now in year 2, the calculated per pupil tuition will be $20,222. That's nearly $900 more than it was calculated just 1 year ago, even though there's no additional cost to the system. Why is that? Well, that's the third whammy.
Rather than base tuition on the amount that charter schools are spending on their own students, current law bases it on the amount that school districts are spending on their students, which is rising due to whammy number 2. And it's also based on the amount that districts spend on charter school tuition. As we showed before, the tuition that charter schools receive is very different than the amount that charter schools are actually spending on students receiving special education. And because those inflated rates are baked into the calculation, and because we keep dividing those overpayments by 16% instead of the actual number of students, the tuition rate is just going to keep growing each year. So let's clear the deck and look at one more year. We'll go through this very quickly, but in year 2, the charter school takes more students from Tier 1, more students from Tier 2, and more in Tier 3, but they're taken at the same rate, so their actual per pupil spending is the same. This time, $504,000 of spending divided by 40 students comes out to $12,600 per student. But of course, they're now receiving tuition from the previous year of $22,222, and that comes out to a total tuition of $808,880. Again, in the district, we calculate year 2, and in the school district now, the actual per pupil spending is up to $16,225. That's $700 greater than it was in year 0. But again, that's not how we calculate the tuition rate. To do that, the district adds total spending on district students and total spending on charter tuition, which is again divided by 160 students, or 16% of the total number of students. And now in year 3, charter school special education will be $21,280. You get the idea, right? So let's skip ahead to years 3, 4, and 5 just to get the bottom line. In year 3, Choice Charter School takes more students, and tuition for year 4 continues to rise. Again, in year 4, Choice Charter School takes more students, and tuition for year 5 continues to rise. And again, in year 5, Choice Charter School again takes more students. So here we are in year 5, and there are exactly 100 students receiving special education in both Choice Charter School and in Sylvania School District. And now it's very clear how students are unevenly distributed. The majority of Tier 1 students are in Choice Charter School, and the majority of Tier 2 and 3 students are in Sylvania School District. And because this is out of 100 students in each sector, the total number is equal to the percentage. 5 years later, and the charter school is still spending $12,600 per student, but now they're receiving a tuition rate that's nearly twice that of $24,390 per student. And in the school district, spending escalated to $18,400 per student, which is nearly $3,000 more than they were spending in year 0. And again, the charter school special education tuition rate continues to climb, By year 6, it would be $26,744. All of this is due to the triple whammies of 1, dividing expenditures by 16% of total students rather than by counting the actual number of students receiving special education. 2, by the fact that school district per pupil costs are going up as charter schools under-enroll students in tiers 2 and 3. And the third whammy is that the inflated charter school tuition continues to compound because it's based on district costs and on the amount that districts spend on charter school tuition rather than the amount that charter schools themselves actually spend on their students.
So to recap, what we're seeing here is that the actual cost per pupil in the system, both district and charter combined, stays the same at $15,500 per student. But the actual cost per pupil in the school district is increasing each year. Meanwhile, the charter school tuition rate is also increasing even more dramatically, and the gap between the tuition rate and the actual cost that charter schools are spending on students is also growing. Also notable is that the tuition rate isn't just increasing, but it's increasing at a greater rate each year. And one last time, this is all occurring due to the Commonwealth triple whammy, and those whammies are 1, not accurately counting students and instead dividing by 16% of the total student body. 2, charter schools underserving students in high-cost tiers, which drives up costs in school districts. And 3, overpayments from whammy number 1 and whammy number 2 compounding into future years, and that drives payments up higher and higher each year, even if there's no actual increase in total district expenditures on special education. Now, I want to leave you with a few final observations about this system. The first is that the triple whammy phenomenon can happen in reverse. A reverse triple whammy occurs if school districts have fewer than 16% of their students receiving special education, because then they're dividing their expenditures by a larger number of students than they actually serve. It can also happen in reverse if charter school sector enrolls students in the high cost category tiers at a disproportionately high rate. That then drives up spending in charter schools and drives down spending in school districts. The reverse triple whammy is less common, but it is occurring in a number of school district communities in Pennsylvania. The second observation is that the triple whammy creates some perverse incentives for both charter schools and school districts. For example, charter schools are incentivized to over-identify students with low-cost special education needs because it would be a financial boon to their schools if they did so. And school districts are incentivized to do the opposite, to under-identify students requiring special education, because if they keep their special education rate below 16%, that creates a low charter tuition rate and then serves as a financial boon to school districts. Now, of course, it would be illegal for either charter schools or school districts to do this, but we shouldn't have a funding system that provides financial incentives to do things that aren't compliant with the law. The third observation is that the tension that's created by the Commonwealth triple whammy is exacerbated by an overall inadequate level of state funding for special education in Pennsylvania. Expenditures on special education have always exceeded revenues by a significant amount. But in recent years, the expenditures have gone up dramatically, while revenues have stayed flat. And all of this is made worse by the fact that even taking special education funding out of the equation, there's a significant fiscal impact on school districts from charter school expansion. Here's a link to a study from Research for Action where you can learn more about that impact. I want to leave you with a few final words about Governor Wolf's proposal to eliminate the triple whammy and replace it with the three-tiered weights from the special education funding formula. It would eliminate the perverse incentive in the current system, and the governor's calculations are that it would reduce special education funding to charter schools by $99 million. That's a pretty dramatic reduction over a pretty quick time. And there's some legitimate concern about whether the tuition rate will be aligned to the actual cost of providing necessary special education services. We don't want to leave charter schools with too little funding for students receiving special education any more than we want to leave school districts with too little funding. And there's another question about whether this is all happening too much too fast. Would the system be better served by stretching out the reduction over 5 or 10 years? But on the other hand, it's important to consider the impact of the federal stimulus. Charter schools are going to receive a lot of federal stimulus dollars, and they will not experience the reduction in local revenues that's expected to hit school districts. So this just may be the perfect window to reform the way we fund special education in charter schools in Pennsylvania. I'm David Lapp from Research for Action. Thank you for joining us on Pacer TV. Stay tuned for future episodes and check out more Pacer resources below.